The first time Owen Bennett said the cruel part out loud, she made sure there were witnesses. We were in the hotel ballroom, surrounded by people who had dressed carefully and lowered their voices because the day was supposed to be serious. She looked at me as if I was a stain on the family table and said, "Maya helped with the boring parts. Owen is the visionary." I remember the smallest things before I remember the pain. The scrape of a chair leg, the paper cup bending in my hand. The way one person looked down because looking at me would have required choosing a side. Owen Bennett did not shout. She did not need to. She had spent years learning how to make cruelty sound like concern. I could have answered her. I could have told everyone what she had hidden, what I had paid for, what I had signed, what I had carried, while she stood in public and called it hers. But the patent assignment was already in the room. It was inside a folder, on a table, waiting for someone with authority to open it. So I stayed quiet. And when Victor Lang, the lead investor, finally lifted that file and began to read, the room changed so fast that even Owen Bennett forgot to breathe. That was the moment my family learned that quiet people are not empty. Sometimes they are simply keeping records. But before I tell you what happened when that file was opened, if you enjoy long English stories like this one, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you are listening from. My name is Maya Bennett. I am 33 years old, and for most of my adult life, I was the person my family called practical only when they needed something. In every other room, I was described as difficult, emotional, or not quite enough. Owen Bennett, my older brother, had a gift for saying those things in a voice soft enough that other people felt rude for noticing. I was not dramatic. I had a job, bills, a calendar, a small apartment with plants that somehow survived my worst weeks, and a habit of writing everything down. That last habit began as anxiety. Later, it became evidence. At the time, I did not know that a notebook full of dates would one day matter more than Owen Bennett's polished speeches. Our family had a rule that nobody said out loud. Owen Bennett was the center, and I was the backup plan. If something needed to be fixed, I was called. If something needed to be praised, she was called. When I objected, my mother would say, "Please do not make this uncomfortable," as though comfort belonged only to the people causing the harm. The story that reached the dad's retirement party did not begin that morning. It began with hundreds of tiny moments, each one too small to prove alone and too heavy to forget together. If you have ever been the reliable person in a family that only respects performance, you know exactly what I mean. The basement prototype became the first entry I could never fully shake. I can still see a humming desktop tower. Owen said, "You write code. I understand business," while Maya fixed the demo he had broken. The line landed softly, which somehow made it worse, because everyone nearby could pretend they had misunderstood it. That night, I wrote down the time, the names, and the work I had already done before the accusation began. It was not a diary entry. It was a receipt for reality. I wrote it because the room had already begun editing the truth for her. And I knew from experience that silence becomes a family document when nobody challenges it. I thought patience would make me gracious. Mostly, it made me available to people who confused access with love. That was how she turned help into evidence against me. First, she demanded it. Then she denied it. Then she described me as unstable for remembering the demand. Another day I kept returning to was the first client call. What stayed with me was not the room, but a cheap headset. Their father said, "Let Owen do the talking," after Maya had built every feature the client loved. A blunt sentence can wound once. A polished sentence keeps working after the speaker leaves. On the way home, I opened my notes app and typed the sentence exactly. I added who heard it because witnesses have a way of becoming forgetful when comfort is at stake. I kept the note on my phone first, then copied it into a notebook later, because the physical act of writing made the day feel less like a fog and more like something I could survive. The pattern was not loud enough to be called abuse by people who preferred tidy words, but it was consistent enough to shape my entire body. What made it worse was not only the insult. It was the way everyone nearby relaxed once I accepted it, as if my silence had given them permission to stay comfortable. The next mark in my private record came from the trade show booth. There was a badge with the wrong title, ordinary and visible, while the truth was being bent in front of me. Owen introduced her as my technical assistant and squeezed her shoulder like a warning. I remember thinking, so this is how she will tell it. I waited until I was alone before I made the note. My hands were shaking, so I wrote slowly. Date first, place second, words third. Order helped me not fall apart. By then, I had learned that memory alone was treated like attitude in our family. But a date, a place, and a direct quote were harder to wave away. What hurt was the choreography. She created the need, I filled the gap, and then the family applauded the person standing closest to the story. Families like ours do not always punish you with one dramatic betrayal. Sometimes they train you with tiny public corrections until you begin correcting yourself before they speak. I also wrote about the family dinner. If I close my eyes, I still notice a folded napkin before I notice any face, their aunt said. It must be nice to help your brother. And Maya swallowed the correction. Nobody had to agree out loud. Their silence did enough. I put the detail in my notebook before I let myself cry. That sounds cold unless you have lived with someone who uses your tears as proof that you are unreliable. I did not understand yet that I was building a case. I only understood that if I did not record the moment, someone would soon tell me it had been smaller than it was. I kept asking myself why the supposedly unreliable person was always the first call when something had to be solved before morning. I kept thinking, if I am as unreliable as she says, why does she keep calling me when something breaks? That question sat in me like a stone. If you were in my place at that point, would you have spoken up earlier, or would you have kept collecting proof? Write one sentence in English in the comments if you want the practice. The attorney's email looked harmless from the outside. That is why I remember a subject line marked urgent so clearly. Owen replied, "Do not overcomplicate things," when the lawyer asked who owned the invention. The cruelty was dressed as practicality, and practical cruelty often gets invited to stay. I saved the message, copied the quote, and attached the context. I hated needing that kind of discipline, but I hated being rewritten even more. The note looked ordinary when I finished it. One sentence, 3 names, 1 object. But ordinary records can become powerful when they are allowed to accumulate. There is a kind of family math where one person does the work and another person receives the title. I had been living inside that equation for years. The pattern was simple enough to miss. She wanted my labor private, her authority public, and my objections translated as selfishness. By the time the investor rehearsal happened, I already knew the script. The prop in that version was a clicker with a dead battery. Owen said, "Smile if they ask about the tech," as if Maya was decoration. I heard the old family role being assigned to me again, line by line. I made the record because I could already hear the future explanation. She was tired, she meant well, I took it the wrong way. The note answered before the excuse arrived. I saved the message, took a screenshot, and hated myself for needing proof from people who were supposed to know my character without a file. Every scene taught the same lesson with different props. My labor was useful, my account of it was inconvenient, and my pain was bad manners. Each time I let it pass, I told myself I was protecting peace. Years later, I understood I had mostly been protecting the people who benefited from the disorder. The last scene that mattered before the file was the retirement toast. There was a glass of sparkling cider, and there was the old pressure to make myself smaller. Dad said, Owen built a company from nothing, while Maya stood beside the sound table. This time, I did not argue. I documented. I took a screenshot, then another, because the first rule of being doubted is this: keep the original. The second rule is do not apologize for keeping it. Later, that entry would matter because it showed the pattern did not appear suddenly. It had a history, and history has weight. By then, I no longer needed one perfect incident. The repetition itself had become the evidence, and repetition was exactly what they had counted on me ignoring. By the time the file existed, this single scene was no longer a complaint. It was one tile in a floor they had all walked across for years. The decision that changed everything arrived quietly, not like revenge, but like paperwork. I was sitting at my kitchen table with the old notes, the emails, and the messages spread in front of me when I realized Owen Bennett's story only worked because everyone heard it first. The truth existed, but it was scattered. I needed it to become a file. That was when Sophia Chen, the company's first technical advisor, entered the story. The first conversation was not dramatic. It was careful, professional, and almost painfully calm. I said, I am not asking you to take my side. I am asking you to look at the dates. Sophia Chen did not flatter me. That helped. They asked for records, not emotions. They asked for receipts, messages, school forms, signatures, and dates. For the first time in years, someone treated my memory as a starting point instead of a problem. I spent 3 weekends building the chronology that would become the patent assignment. Every page had a source. Every claim had a date. Every emotional sentence had to be translated into something a stranger could verify. That process hurt more than I expected because it showed me how much I had normalized. The hardest page was not the one that made Owen Bennett look bad. The hardest page was the one that showed how long I had kept helping after I understood she would never tell the truth about it. I looked at that page and said out loud, "This is what love cost me." Then I printed it anyway. People imagine a breaking point as a slammed door or a public speech. Mine was quieter. I bought a new binder, a pack of tabs, and a box of plain envelopes. I labeled the first tab Timeline, and the second tab what the prototype needed. That second tab kept me honest. I was not trying to destroy Owen Bennett. That is important. Anger can tell the truth, but it can also make you careless, and I could not afford careless. I wanted the truth to land cleanly enough that nobody could call it a scene. There is a strange peace that comes when you stop begging people to remember you kindly and start protecting the facts. The facts did not hug me.
They did not apologize, but they stayed still. And after years of moving targets, stillness felt almost generous.
If this story is helping your English listening practice, pause for a second and write down 3 words you heard clearly. Small habits like that make long stories more useful. Owen Bennett sensed the shift before she understood it. People like her do not fear conflict as much as they fear documentation. She began calling me cold in front of relatives. She said, "Maya Bennett has changed. She is not acting like family anymore." The old version of me would have defended my softness, listed every favor, explained every late night and every swallowed insult. The new version said, "I am sorry you feel that way," and saved the message. That sentence made her angrier than any accusation could have. The week before the dad's retirement party, Owen Bennett tried one last private performance. She called and said, "If you embarrass me, everyone will know what kind of person you are." I wrote the sentence down while she was still talking. I did not tell her I had a file. I did not tell her who had reviewed it. I did not tell her the hearing would not be a contest of volume. I simply said, "I will be there on time." Then I hung up and checked that the binder was in my bag. The morning of the dad's retirement party, the room looked too ordinary for what it was about to hold. Fluorescent lights, plastic chairs, a clock that clicked louder than it should have. Owen Bennett arrived dressed as if photographs would be taken. She smiled at people before she looked at me. Then came the sentence from the cold open. Maya helped with the boring parts. Owen is the visionary. She said it with the polished sadness of a person who had practiced being pitied. A few heads turned toward me. I looked at my hands and let the silence do what my voice could not. Victor Lang, the lead investor, asked one question. "Is the file complete?" Sophia Chen answered, "Yes." That was all. No speech, no music, no dramatic interruption. Just a file moving from one pair of hands to another. When Victor Lang, the lead investor, opened the patent assignment, Owen Bennett's smile stayed on her face for about 2 seconds too long. Then the first date was read. Then the first receipt. Then the first message. The room became very still. The investor asked who had signed the original invention disclosure. Victor Lang read it in a tone so neutral that it became impossible to argue with. Nobody gasped, because real rooms do not always know when history has shifted. They only become careful, and that carefulness was everywhere. Sophia opened the scanned patent assignment and pointed to Maya's name on every creator line. Victor Lang read it in a tone so neutral that it became impossible to argue with. Owen Bennett leaned toward her papers, as if the right sentence might still be hiding there. But documentation is not impressed by posture. The contract showed Owen held marketing rights, not ownership of the core software. Victor Lang read it in a tone so neutral that it became impossible to argue with. I heard someone behind me whisper, "I did not know that." And the simple fact that they did not know became part of the answer.
The investor paused the celebration and said, "Then I need to speak to the founder." Victor Lang read it in a tone so neutral that it became impossible to argue with. The sentence settled over the room with no ornament at all. That was why it worked. It did not ask to be believed. It showed where belief had failed. The decisive moment was not when Owen Bennett looked ashamed. It was when someone finally asked me a direct question, instead of asking Owen Bennett to explain me. Victor Lang said, "Maya Bennett, is there anything you want to add?" I could have used that moment to punish her. Instead, I said the sentence I had rehearsed for weeks. I only want the decision to be based on what actually happened. It was not dramatic. It was enough. The ruling did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like a door closing softly and firmly. Victor Lang summarized the evidence, named the pattern, and said the court could not rely on Owen Bennett's version of events. For the first time all day, Owen Bennett had no sentence ready. I watched my family's faces while the decision was explained. Some looked embarrassed. Some looked confused. A few looked annoyed because facts are inconvenient when you have built a comfortable lie. Nobody looked at me the way they had looked at me that morning. The patent assignment did not make me louder. It made loudness unnecessary. That is the part I wish I had understood earlier. You do not always need the room to like you. Sometimes you need the record to outlast them. Maya did not take the microphone to humiliate Owen. She answered the investors' questions in a side room while the cake melted under the lights. It was not forgiveness, and it was not revenge. It was the beginning of a life where the truth no longer needed to whisper. Their father apologized first for the speech. Then 2 weeks later, for all the years he had mistaken noise for leadership. I had expected victory to feel bright. Instead, it felt steady, like a chair placed under someone who had been standing too long. Owen remained in sales under a written agreement that named Maya as founder and chief architect. The consequence was ordinary on paper and enormous in my body. I stopped arranging my life around the fear that she would tell the story first. The company survived, smaller and quieter, and Maya kept the original clicker in her desk drawer as a reminder that she would never stand by the sound table again. Some endings do not announce themselves. They arrive when you notice you are breathing normally in a room that once made you shrink. A week later, Owen Bennett sent a message that began, "I hope you are happy." I stared at it for a long time and realized I did not need to answer every door just because someone knocked with guilt. I saved the message, then put my phone face down. My mother asked whether we could all move forward. I said, "Moving forward starts with telling the truth about what happened behind us." She cried. I did not comfort her immediately. That was new for both of us. People ask whether the public reveal felt satisfying. The honest answer is complicated. It felt clean. It felt sad. It felt like taking off a heavy coat in a room where everyone had insisted I was not cold. Satisfaction came later, in smaller moments. It came when I opened my notebook and did not need to write anything down that day. It came when the prototype stopped being used as a symbol and started being treated like a person. It came when I walked past the place where Owen Bennett had humiliated me and felt memory without obedience. If you are the quiet one in your family, the one who remembers the dates, the one who gets called sensitive for noticing the pattern, I want you to hear this clearly. A lie can be popular and still be a lie. A truth can be lonely and still be true. You are allowed to protect the record. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you never miss a new long English story. I post regularly, and I always read your comments. I did not win because I became crueler than Owen Bennett. I won because I stopped handing her the pen. The patent assignment did not create the truth. It only carried it into a room where people finally had to listen. And if you are carrying a truth like that right now, quietly, carefully, almost ashamed of how much proof you need, please do not mistake your quiet for weakness. Sometimes quiet is discipline. Sometimes quiet is preparation. And sometimes quiet is the sound a person makes while building a file strong enough to survive the room. Looking back at the basement prototype, I understand why a humming desktop tower stayed in my mind. Objects do not revise themselves when the audience changes. They sit there, plain and stubborn, holding the shape of a day. When I later wrote, "This happened," I was not trying to make the day bigger. I was trying to keep it from being erased. The sentence from that day mattered because it had a job. Owen said, "You write code." I understand business, while Maya fixed the demo he had broken. It taught everyone nearby how they were supposed to see me. And it taught me how carefully Owen Bennett managed the room. For a long time, I confused endurance with kindness. Precision taught me that kindness without boundaries can become permission. Looking back at the first client call, I understand why a cheap headset stayed in my mind. A physical detail can keep a memory from floating away. It gives the mind a handle when everyone else is trying to make the story slippery. When I later wrote, "This happened," I was not trying to make the day bigger. I was trying to keep it from being erased. The sentence from that day mattered because it had a job. Their father said, "Let Owen do the talking," after Maya had built every feature the client loved. It taught everyone nearby how they were supposed to see me. And it taught me how carefully Owen Bennett managed the room. I used to answer with explanations. The record taught me to answer with sequence. What happened first? Who knew? What changed afterward? Looking back at the trade show booth, I understand why a badge with the wrong title stayed in my mind. I used to think remembering objects was strange. Later, I understood that the room had been asking me to doubt people, not things. When I later wrote, "This happened," I was not trying to make the day bigger. I was trying to keep it from being erased. The sentence from that day mattered because it had a job. Owen introduced her as my technical assistant and squeezed her shoulder like a warning. It taught everyone nearby how they were supposed to see me, and it taught me how carefully Owen Bennett managed the room. The old instinct was to soften every sentence so nobody felt accused. The new instinct was to make every sentence verifiable. Looking back at the family dinner, I understand why a folded napkin stayed in my mind. That small detail became a hook for the truth. When I could not trust the conversation, I could still trust what had been in front of me. When I later wrote, "This happened," I was not trying to make the day bigger. I was trying to keep it from being erased. The sentence from that day mattered because it had a job. Their aunt said, "It must be nice to help your brother," and Maya swallowed the correction. It taught everyone nearby how they were supposed to see me, and it taught me how carefully Owen Bennett managed the room. I had spent years trying to sound reasonable to unreasonable people. The file asked a better question. Can the facts stand without my pleading? Looking back at the attorney's email, I understand why a subject line marked urgent stayed in my mind. The object was not proof by itself, but it kept the scene located. It stopped the hurt from becoming a blur. When I later wrote, "This happened," I was not trying to make the day bigger. I was trying to keep it from being erased. The sentence from that day mattered because it had a job. Owen replied, "Do not overcomplicate things," when the lawyer asked who owned the invention. It taught everyone nearby how they were supposed to see me, and it taught me how carefully Owen Bennett managed the room. Patience had kept the relationship alive, but it had also kept the distortion alive. Accuracy became the first honest boundary. Looking back at the investor rehearsal, I understand why a clicker with a dead battery stayed in my mind. I returned to that detail whenever someone tried to make the day abstract. Specifics are a quiet form of resistance. When I later wrote, "This happened," I was not trying to make the day bigger. I was trying to keep it from being erased. The sentence from that day mattered because it had a job. Owen said, "Smile if they ask about the tech," as if Maya was decoration. It taught everyone nearby how they were supposed to see me. And it taught me how carefully Owen Bennett managed the room. I stopped trying to prove my goodness and started proving the timeline. That difference changed the whole room. Looking back at the retirement toast, I understand why a glass of sparkling cider stayed in my mind. That visible thing anchored what the adults wanted to turn into mood, attitude, or misunderstanding. When I later wrote, "This happened," I was not trying to make the day bigger. I was trying to keep it from being erased. The sentence from that day mattered because it had a job. Dad said, "Owen built a company from nothing," while Maya stood beside the sound table. It taught everyone nearby how they were supposed to see me, and it taught me how carefully Owen Bennett managed the room. The lesson was not to become hard. The lesson was to stop letting soft-heartedness destroy the record. The one part of the record mattered because it joined emotion to proof. The investor asked who had signed the original invention disclosure. Someone near the back said, "Wait, that was in the file?" And for a second, I felt the old story crack without my hands on it. The two part of the record mattered because it joined emotion to proof. Sophia opened the scanned patent assignment and pointed to Maya's name on every creator line. Someone near the back said, "Wait, that was in the file?" And for a second, I felt the old story crack without my hands on it. The three part of the record mattered because it joined emotion to proof. The contract showed Owen held marketing rights, not ownership of the core software. Someone near the back said, "Wait, that was in the file?" And for a second, I felt the old story crack without my hands on it. The four part of the record mattered because it joined emotion to proof. The investor paused the celebration and said, "Then I need to speak to the founder." Someone near the back said, "Wait, that was in the file?" And for a second, I felt the old story crack without my hands on it. The aftermath had a shape to it, quieter than the reveal and harder to explain. Maya did not take the microphone to humiliate Owen. She answered the investor's questions in a side room while the cake melted under the lights. I remember thinking, this is what truth feels like after the room stops looking. It was not loud, but it was durable. The aftermath had a two shape to it,
quieter than the reveal, and harder to explain. Their father apologized first for the speech. Then 2 weeks later, for all the years he had mistaken noise for leadership. I remember thinking, this is what truth feels like after the room stops looking. It was not loud, but it was durable. The aftermath had a shape to it, quieter than the reveal, and harder to explain. Owen remained in sales under a written agreement that named Maya as founder and chief architect. I remember thinking, this is what truth feels like after the room stops looking. It was not loud, but it was durable. The aftermath had a 4 shape to it, quieter than the reveal and harder to explain. The company survived, smaller and quieter, and Maya kept the original clicker in her desk drawer as a reminder that she would never stand by the sound table again. I remember thinking, this is what truth feels like after the room stops looking. It was not loud, but it was durable. There was one more detail I keep returning to. After the room emptied, I saw the folder again, closed now, ordinary on the table where the patent assignment had been read. It looked too plain for something that had carried so much weight. And maybe that is the point. The things that save us are not always beautiful. Sometimes they are organized, dated, and finally handed to the right person. I also remember the walk outside afterward. The air had the dull gray color of a day that had no idea it had become important to somebody. For several minutes, I did not call anyone. I did not explain, soften, translate, or repair. I simply stood there and let the silence belong to me. That quiet stayed with me longer than the public part. It was the first quiet in years that did not feel like surrender. It felt like a locked door, not against love, but against distortion. I needed that door. A cousin texted later and wrote, "I did not know what you had been doing." That sentence stayed with me because it was not an apology, but it was the first honest sentence anyone outside the center of the storm had offered. I answered, I know, because knowing and excusing are not the same thing. Owen Bennett tried to describe the reveal as betrayal, which almost made me laugh. Betrayal is not what happens when hidden work becomes visible. Betrayal is needing hidden work in the first place and then punishing the person who carried it. I did not send that sentence to her. I kept it for myself. The strangest part was how quickly people wanted the story to become simple. They asked, "Are you relieved?" And I never knew how to answer with one word. Relief was there, yes, but so was grief for every year when a truthful conversation might have saved us all from that room.